Elite Barbarians have had one of the biggest impacts on Clash Royale history out of any card. Without any background knowledge on the Elite Barbarians, they may just seem like your typical melee defense card, but if you're a long-term player, you might have PTSD from looking at this image. There are certainly many cards in Clash Royale's past that have been game-breaking, but the Elite Barbarians at their peak were in a very unique environment that could never be replicated today. These menaces were handled very differently than overpowered cards are handled nowadays, and ultimately led to changing the way Supercell balances and releases cards forever. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the entire history of the Elite Barbarians, where they came from, their enormous impact on Clash Royale, and where they remain today. Before we get into the history, let me introduce you to Honkai Impact 3rd, a 3D cross-platform open-world exploration free-to-play action game from HoYoverse, the makers of Genshin Impact and the upcoming Honkai Star Rail. This story has a new chapter beginning with Nagazora. The Shitzel investigators are on a new case. Here are the top 3 things you need to know about this new update. One of the Shitzel investigators, Susanna, will become Valkyrie Quicksand, whose playstyle will merge dance steps and music together, making her both gorgeous and elegant. The next thing you need to know is that 2 new events are in the new version. My personal favorite is the Meow Town Escapade event, where you'll explore a picturesque town and find kittens all over the place. And the final thing I want to tell you about this update is that 2 new outfits will be coming as well. My favorite one is Turn Up the Music for Hersher of Sentience. The version 6.5 update for Honkai Impact 3rd has a ton of new content in this update that just launched. Download now using the link in the description or the pinned comment and use code NEWCHAP to get 30 crystals, 2,888 asteroids, and 1 character trial card for free. So where did Elite Barbarians come from? Elite Barbarians derived from regular Barbarians, which came from Clash of Clans. In case you didn't know, leveling up troops in Clash of Clans changes the appearances of troops, unlike Clash Royale. The Elite Barbarian's appearance is based off of the level 6 Barbarian in that game. But what makes an Elite Barbarian elite? Comparing its original stats to the Barbarians, it was 1 more elixir and only had half the units the Barbarians had, with slightly more range, damage, and health. They were really only slightly better than regular Barbarians except for 1 critical stat, their movement speed. Barbarians moved at a medium movement speed, but Elite Barbarians moved at a very fast movement speed. This was their unique feature, as it seems their intended purpose was to serve as a strong defense that could transfer into a high-pressure offensive counterpush. This card was leaked weeks before it came out, and there were people who thought it would be good and others who thought it would be really bad, which is nothing notable because that happens with every leaked card. But when the card came out on November 25th, 2016, they had quite a soft landing. Slightly buffed stats and a faster movement speed was not enough justification for 1 additional elixir and half the units. They had much less DPS than regular Barbarians and couldn't form a good wall like Barbarians could. And it wasn't like at the time the Elite Barbarians had the advantage of being able to survive a fireball, because Barbarians could survive a fireball as well. However, Elite Barbarians could survive a lightning, so I suppose that's one advantage. There really isn't much else to say about the card at the time because nobody was really using it. In the top 100 finishing decks for November 2016, Elite Barbarians unsurprisingly appeared in 0 of them. When I say they were bad, I mean they were bad. But it's okay, new cards are rarely ever released perfectly balanced. With the December update just around the corner, balance changes would come with it. And the Elite Barbarians were certainly not forgotten. They were given 3 different buffs in this one balance change. First was a health buff of 19%, which is a pretty big health buff. There weren't any major interaction changes due to the health change, but it did allow them to survive 1 extra hit from a variety of cards. The other 2 changes were a damage buff of 14% and a hit speed buff of 0.1 seconds. This allowed the Elite Barbarians to not only kill a variety of cards with 1 less hit, but also able to one-shot archers and fully counter a Hog Rider without it getting a single hit. These interactions were especially huge considering how popular Hog Rider and archers both were at the time. Now, I know the card was really bad upon launch, but this was a huge buff for a card that had only been out for a few weeks. These changes were officially applied on December 15th, 2016. So now let's observe how these changes impacted the meta for the December 2016 season.
Elite Barbarians are ridiculous. What might have been the worst card in the game before the update came out is now one of the strongest.
No minion horde, there it is. Zap this, minion horde's dead. Elite Barbarians go again, they're getting work done.
Oh, you know, it could have been a fantastic, actually. Oh, okay, never mind. Do that, actually, because the barbs was only counter to the Elite barbs, and so now we did some serious damage.
Take a look at the Elite Barbarians in the left-hand lane. I dropped Elite Barbarians because I knew he invested way too much in the right-hand lane, and the Elite Barbarians by themselves, plus I guess an archer shot or 2, are gonna take out the tower.
We can take out this princess as well. Nope. We are gonna be able to take out that tower, though. Come forward, princess. He's not gonna come forward.
I think I want to do the balloon or the tornado spell. Look at those Elite Barbarians, guys. That tower is gone in like a couple seconds.
And let's go ahead and try to finish off the game towards the very top. So Elite Barbarians have gone down. The log just barely missed them as they run towards the tower. And now we have double Elite Barbarians, a Hog Rider, and some archers. And this game is over.
Within just days of this buff, this card went from having a 0% use rate in top ladder to a 33% use rate. This was a miserable time to be a casual player. The Elite Barbarians weren't just viable, they were overpowered. A community poll around this time concluded that players thought the Elite Barbarians were the strongest card a card had ever been. The game was less than a year old at this point, but that's still telling, especially when you had the Royal Giant in the poll, which was considered overpowered by a lot of players as well. Undoubtedly, the Elite Barbarians were overpowered as they were all over ladder and being used heavily in competitive play. If you were in mid ladder though, it was so much worse. And this is where a deeper problem with the Elite Barbarians lied. Since Elite Barbarians were a common card, it was fairly easy to level them up quickly. Common cards were incredibly easy to level up compared to any other rarity because you got way more of them out of chests proportional to how many you needed to level a card up than other rarities. And with requests, you were able to request 40 commons up to 3 times a day, unlike epics where you could only request 4 per week and legendaries not at all. You could also request 4 rares 3 times a day, but 4 rares was almost nothing when it came to making progress to leveling up rare cards. Just for some frame of reference, at the time if you requested a common card 3 times a day from unlocking it to maxing it out, it would take about 80 days to max it out. And if you did the same for rare cards, it would take about 215 days. And besides requesting, there was really no way to control which cards you got, making it especially hard to level up cards of specific rarities besides commons and rares. Because of this disparity between rarities, it wasn't uncommon to see level 13 commons going against cards of other rarities 2 or even 3 levels below them on the level scale. This led to many unintended interactions, such as Elite Barbarians surviving 3 hits from a P.E.K.K.A instead of 2, or even surviving a rocket. Without a higher max level deck, these guys were simply unstoppable. And there were 2 cards commonly paired with the E-Barbs, enhancing their power further. And it's not what you're thinking. Those 2 cards were the Ice Golem and the Zap. Of course, swarming a card like Elite Barbarians could counter it well on its own, so to counter the counter, Elite Barbarian players would almost always carry a Zap to instantly get rid of skeletons or goblins that would otherwise swarm the Elite Barbarians for a positive elixir trade. Zap was incredibly overpowered in general, being used in 83% of top 100 decks in December 2016, as the versatility and power were unmatched. The Ice Golem was very strong during this time as well, appearing in just over half of all the top finishing decks. Ice Golem was really versatile, being able to absorb a lot of damage and slowing down units upon death, just helping the Elite Barbarians even more. Both of these cards shot up in use rate from the previous season thanks to the Elite Barbarians, as the meta was now circulating around them. At top ladder, these were the 2 most popular decks with Elite Barbarians shortly after the buff. By the end of December, Elite Barbarians had settled to having a 22% use rate in top 100 ladder. By now, Royal Giant and Giant were seeing a lot less usage. 3 Musketeers were also popping up more often alongside the Elite Barbarians in top ladder quite a bit. But Hog Rider was the most popular win condition by far to appear alongside them. Hog Rider was just a very powerful card that Supercell for some reason was just very reluctant to nerf. And Hog Rider actually had a slightly higher usage rate than Elite Barbarians by now, being the most popular win condition in competitive play. The Hog Rider Elite Barbarian with Ice Golem combo just had unmatched tempo that was practically unstoppable unless you had great reflexes and a perfect defense. This was a pretty miserable, unbalanced meta, as you could imagine. By the end of December, there were only 70 cards in the game, and 26 of them saw absolutely 0 usage in top 100 ladder by the end of the season. And even though Elite Barbarians were ranked number 14 in terms of use rate, players really felt like they were seeing them a lot more. And that was probably because people were seeing them more. The stats I'm talking about is just a small subsection of one of the more competitive areas of the game. This was an area where overleveling wasn't a problem, hence why stats were considered more from top ladder to determine whether a card was truly balanced. I couldn't find an official stat from general ladder, but from anecdotes I could find, it seemed like some players in mid to lower ladder were seeing Elite Barbarians in nearly 40% of their games. Elite Barbarians were really like a mid-ladder player's dream. Overpowered, easy to play, fun to play, and easy to level up. Not to mention it was a great counter to the Royal Giant and the Hog Rider, which were the most popular win conditions in mid-ladder. Royal Giant was suffering in competitive play due to the Elite Barbarians, but was still thriving in mid-ladder despite Elite Barbarians being much more prominent there. And the Royal Giant is actually notable in the conversation of Elite Barbarians because they had a lot in common. They were both 6 elixir common cards that were fairly easy to play. The Royal Giant was in a position where it was below average in competitive play now, appearing in just 4% of top ladder decks. This was a huge drop from the 15% of decks that had appeared in the month before Elite Barbarians got their big buff. When we take a look at the stats from earlier in the year from when Royal Giant was overpowered, it was being used in about 30% of mid to lower ladder decks, where it was only used in about 12% of top ladder decks. The reason I bring this up is because Royal Giant was the first card to show a massive disparity in the different environments, and Elite Barbarians were heading down that same path. Most players didn't choose between one or the other, as the Royal Giant Elite Barbarians actually become a very popular combo during December 2016 in casual ladder. With how strong and easy it was to play these cards when overleveled, it was a priority for most players to level these cards up, as it was practically required to survive in the mid-ladder environment. If you weren't using these cards at the time, you had to have a deck specifically to counter them, or else you wouldn't have a chance. Another combo I can't skip over because of how notable it was the Elite Barbarians Rage combo. Making this already fast card even faster gave almost zero reaction time to the defender. Without perfect defense, these menaces with the purple toxin could wipe out your tower within seconds of being placed at the bridge, and this is how Elite Barbarians in the mid-ladder environment were primarily being played. They were being used as a win condition, not a defensive card to turn into a counter push. Even though the Rage spell was an epic card, it was not level dependent like most cards, meaning it would always get about the same amount of value regardless of the level. Rage also got a buff just a few weeks before the Elite Barbarians were introduced, and that was not great timing. And I don't want to get this confused, this was certainly not a competitively viable combo, as Rage had absolutely zero usage in the highest competitive environment and was considered to be one of the worst cards in the game. But the Elite Barbarians with Royal Giant combo and Elite Barbarians with Rage combo became iconic because of how often these cards were used together. As an active player around this time, I will say to those complaining about the Mega Knight or Electro Giant nowadays would not last 5 minutes in the game during the December 2016 era. If you think mid-ladder is rough today, you could not imagine how bad it used to be. I say this with 100% certainty that this era was the most toxic and frustrating time to be a casual mid-ladder player in all of Clash Royale history. But despite the problem with overleveling, Elite Barbarians were also thriving heavily in competitive play, meaning it wasn't really a debate of whether or not they needed a nerf. They certainly did need a nerf. For a card that was so game-breaking and so toxic, it could even be argued an emergency nerf could be justified. But this was 2016. There was no such thing as an emergency nerf. A card had never really been broken on this level before, disrupting the health of the meta so greatly, except for one card, the Royal Giant, who had about the same usage rate as Elite Barbarians during its peak. And on top of that, there were no scheduled balance changes, unlike today where we know exactly when balance changes are coming. Players complained and begged for Elite Barbarian nerfs for weeks and weeks, unsure when the graceful nerf hammer would relieve them from this mid-ladder hellscape. Over 1 month after this unprecedented buff, with the Elite Barbarians controlling the meta for 5 weeks, a new set of balance changes would finally be announced to go live at the end of January 2017, and Elite Barbarians were right at the top of the list, receiving a nerf just as harsh as the previous buff was generous. Their hit speed would be reverted back to 1.5 seconds, as well as nerfing its damage and health. The biggest interaction change was now that a mini P.E.K.K.A. would survive 5 Elite Barbarian hits instead of 4, allowing it to fully counter them with the assistance of the tower. This was a pretty harsh nerf, but the card was definitely in need of a big nerf and some more counter options to get it closer to that healthy range of intended use. This nerf was just about what the card needed to make it balanced in competitive play, if it wasn't for some other major changes that came in the same set of balance changes. Zab and Log, which were both very popular cards, received nerfs, leading to spell-bait decks becoming quite popular. You were also seeing more mini P.E.K.K.A., Prince, and Skeleton Army, which were all solid counters against the Elite duo. And Goblins were more effective against Elite Barbarians since they couldn't just be zapped away anymore. With all of these factors, Elite Barbarians dropped to just a 3% usage rate in top 100 ladder play, falling to 0% after the release of the Executioner just a few days later. Elite Barbarians were no longer considered competitively viable, but because of its common status and newcomer appeal, it was still very popular in the mid-ladder range. As people leveled them up, the use rates only continued to rise, and the complaints corresponded with it. Any post or video Supercell posted was flooded with comments of people asking for Elite Barbarian and Royal Giant nerfs. You might notice that I keep bringing up the Royal Giant quite a bit, and that's because I really can't talk about the Elite Barbarians, especially in the early stages, without bringing up this card because they were just so synonymous with each other. Royal Giant was actually pretty balanced in competitive play in January 2017, whereas Elite Barbarians sucked in competitive play, but both cards were insanely popular in mid-ladder because of how easy they were to overlevel and dominate with. This was a unique problem that had not been an issue until these two cards came along. Nerfing Elite Barbarians didn't make sense because they sucked on a competitive level. However, them being played so much on ladder at the same time could justify a nerf. There were two more sets of balance changes in February and March of that year, and Elite Barbarians and Royal Giant had not been included in the balance changes in both instances, which only increased the frustration. A lot of players just didn't take the competitive scene into account. It wasn't widely understood that mid and high ladder were practically two different metas, and Supercell was struggling to find the right balance. On April 15th, 2017, Supercell would put out an episode of Radio Royale where one of the main topics of discussion was the Elite Barbarian and Royal Giant problem. This is where they mainly talked about the problems I've already discussed in the video in regards to those cards.
They are actually like highly used only at a certain trophy range, roughly 3,500 to 5,000. At that level, they are used quite a lot to the point that it's actually quite unhealthy. Both the Royal Giant and the Elite Barbarians are used way below average in the top 100. It's easier to upgrade these cards because they're commons, so that makes them more appealing for many players. Is the problem really with the game economy, or is it with the cards themselves?
The economy was a long-standing issue well known by many players at this point, so this led to creative potential solutions. One idea was to change the card's rarity to rare so that they would be harder to level up.
We were thinking, for example, about changing the rarities of these two cards, but that becomes quite complex. So what if we would change them to rares? If we change a max level card to a max level card, nothing really changes. And if we would make the conversion relative, we would actually downgrade the Royal Giants and Elite Barbarians, and that would be quite nasty.
Capping card levels was also a potential idea.
Another thing that we've explored is capping cards at king level. The idea would be that you can't use cards that are higher level than your king. Might have made sense if that would have been done from the beginning of the game, but to this established live game, that's a pretty tricky one to do.
I feel that maybe that sort of change might mean that players get stuck. If we were to cap the levels of cards, you can no longer progress with those cards in the game, so you have to rely on your skill.
I'm not really sure why they phrased a player needing skill to progress to be a problem, as it seems like that's what you would want, but I guess Supercell was a little more mask-off in 2017. Regardless of their reasoning though, level caps would be difficult and frustrating to implement over a year into the game's lifespan for a variety of reasons. Supercell definitely learned their lesson about accounting for overleveling common cards from the Elite Barbarians, but all their possible solutions stemmed from an issue that couldn't really be changed without causing more problems. This left them with seemingly only one solution: to nerf the Elite Barbarians once again. This Radio Royale episode was actually the official announcement of the Elite Barbarian nerf, of which they said they would be nerfing the first hit attack time by 0.1 seconds and nerfing the health again by 4%. Many players were happy to see this nerf, but many were shocked to see the nerf seemed so small. I think the nerf was just for show, purely meant to appease the player base, and I don't blame Supercell. A small nerf wasn't going to solve the underlying issue with this card, and they clearly knew that. It was already not being used in competitive play, so you might as well make the lower ladder player's game experience a little better in the meantime while you work on a proper fix. And with this nerf, the Elite Barbarians would not receive any more changes for the rest of 2017, and they would continue to be a mid-ladder menace while receiving no more play in the competitive scene. The complaints died down as the year went on, but that does not mean they were gone from people's minds. Throughout 2017, they remained to be a very controversial card. By September 2018, Elite Barbarians had still not received any more changes, and now it had been over a year since their last change. In fact, the Royal Giant received its previous change at the same time as the Elite Barbarians and also had not been changed since then. I'm bringing up the Royal Giant again because these cards were in the same category, and Seth, who was the head of balancing, said that a Royal Giant rework would be coming in an interview, and explained why they would be reworking Royal Giant, but not Elite Barbarians quite yet.
We are currently working on a Royal Giant, I don't want to say buff, its use rates in challenges and its win rates in challenges are really abysmal. Like, they're not where you want them to be for a win condition. And even on ladder, even though Royal Giant is typically thought of as like a ladder terror, there's only one gap, 4,000 to 4,500, where Royal Giants even meet an average use rate. At every other section of the ladder, they are below average use rate. Not a particularly strong card. Elite Barbs are in a little bit of a different spot because even though they are also not very good in challenges, they are very popular on the ladder. Elite Barbarians are one of the top 10 most popular troops on the ladder, and actually, I think one of the top 5 or 10 most popular cards to upgrade in the whole game. Because they're very popular, there's less desire to go out and find a way to buff them.
He then went on to explain the problem with the game's economy causing elite barbarians to be in this state, and talked about changes in the game's economy that would fix it. Supercell would add a ton of changes to help fix the economy over the years, but the one that came in the near future after this interview was trade tokens. But even with these recent improvements, Royal Giant would go on to have a very successful rework, while elite barbarians were left in the dust. By 2019, elite barbarians had just dipped to having the lowest win rate in competitive play that they had ever had. In another interview in March 2019, Seth would be asked about the elite barbarians once again.
E-barbs. They haven't been touched in 2 years.
Elite Barbarians were going to be changed in this balance update. They ended up getting cut in the final edit, the final change down. We do have a change in testing that we've been playing with, and I think there is a meaningful sort of rework buff to Elite Barbarians that will make them good in competitive play and hopefully balanced on the ladder. And we were so excited about the Barbarians change and some of the other changes that are in this balance update that we didn't want to take the focus away from that with the Elite Barbarians change.
I don't want to sound rude, but holding off a balance change simply to not take away hype from other balance changes seemed like a terrible reason to hold off a balance change. Balance changes are just meant to balance the game. If you have something ready, it should be implemented at the next scheduled balance change so the game can be in the most balanced state possible. That is just an opinion though. This must have been a big major rework if they really thought it was going to generate a lot of hype. In fact, it skipped the next 2 balance changes as well. 3 months after this interview in June 2019, the Elite Barbarians would finally receive their long overdue rework. Their damage would be increased by 18%, coming at the cost of their hit speed being increased by 0.2 seconds. The point of this was to allow them to 2-shot fireball leaves while allowing swarms to be a more effective counter to them. This rework just did not seem that significant to me. This is what Supercell could come up with after 2 years? It practically made no difference in the card's performance. Another rework was clearly needed. However, Supercell wouldn't do anything for this card for the rest of 2019 besides increasing the range to keep consistent with the new melee range system. But they did do something else shocking in regards to the Elite Barbarians that implied Supercell may have been intending to delete the Elite Barbarians from the game entirely. New cards would get a video on the Clash Royale YouTube channel upon release to advertise them, and out of nowhere, in December 2019, Supercell would take down the Elite Barbarian introduction video from all their social media, something they had never done before. There was no word as to the reason why, and players became very suspicious.
Save Elite Barbarians.
Save the Elite Barbs!
They're whitewashing the past, as if the Elite Barbarians never existed.
Save the Elite Barbarians.
Save the Elite Barbarians. What else is the point of even having rage in the game if not for raging Elite Barbarians?
Please save them.
Deleting a card from Clash Royale is something Supercell had never done before, which made it seem unlikely that they would start now. But Elite Barbarians had never been healthy for the game since the day they were released, so who knew what they were thinking? Obviously, the Elite Barbarians are still here today, but we never got an explanation as to why they took down the video, and it seemed weird that deleting the card didn't seem out of the question, as deleting a card would be an iconic event. Moving into 2020, Seth put out an interesting poll in February on Twitter with 4 possible reworks for the Elite Barbarians. The winner of the poll was making the Elite Barbarians into the Elite Barbarian and reducing it to 3 elixir. This obviously never happened, but this poll made one thing clear. People did not want the speed of the Elite Barbarians to be changed, as that was the thing Elite Barbarian players enjoyed about it the most. But as time went on, it seemed like the only viable solution to fix this card once and for all was to lower the movement speed. The next month, Seth put out another poll asking which card players would prefer to see reworked in the next month. Elite Barbarians were an option, but they didn't win. However, the poll seemed to be meaningless, as the choice with the least amount of votes ended up getting the rework. But this was telling that players just weren't that eager about a potential Elite Barbarian rework. I brought up these polls just so you could kind of see how the community was thinking at this time. At this point, Elite Barbarians almost just seemed forgotten about by the community. A few months later though, they actually got a small nerf in June, which was a very small stagger deploy time change. This was done to all cards that spawned in pairs for consistency. It wouldn't be until November 2020 where the Elite Barbarians would get yet another rework, where the Elite Barbarians' movement speed would be toned down from very fast to just fast. Its most prominent feature was no more. To compensate for this massive downgrade, their hit speed would be reverted back to 1.5 seconds, as well as a first hit speed buff on top of health and damage increases. In total, this turned out to be a 20% DPS increase. This change did not extract positive comments from the community, but when it was applied at first, it seemed like the card was doing alright. This bridge spam deck also began to trend for a little bit. It seemed like the Elite Barbarians were finally in a healthy spot, at least in competitive play, but by the next month, the rates dropped right back down. But having toned down their obnoxiously fast movement speed, it was safer to buff this card. After giving this card a few months to settle in, Supercell would finally decide to balance it again on March 30th, 2021. They would get a small hit speed buff from 1.5 seconds to 1.4 seconds and a first hit speed buff from 0.5 seconds to 0.4 seconds. No major interaction changes, but a buff is a buff. But nobody could predict just how significant this buff really was. Right before this buff, this card sat at a 1% use rate and a 35% win rate in grand challenges, and within the first few days of this buff, peaked at a 42% use rate and a 58% win rate, easily making it the best card in the entire game. This buff absolutely broke Elite Barbarians once again, with higher rates than it had even in December 2016. Even in the different era of the game where you had cards like Mega Knight and Royal Recruits, the Elite Barbarians outshined their December 2016 selves, dominating the competition. Along with these balance changes as well came a Heal Spirit buff, ultimately leading to an Elixir Golem Battle Healer Elite Barbarian deck shooting up in popularity. It even had the Rage spell, making an Elite Barbarian Rage deck popular in the competitive scene for the first time ever. The rise of this deck was also in part due to the Bomb Tower nerf, which was implemented at the same time. The Giant Skeleton and Knight nerfs also played a significant part in the Elite Barbarians' rise during this time. After a few more days, this Fireball bait deck also rose to being very popular as well. But it didn't stop there. Elite Barbarians were also having success in Golem and Three Musketeer decks. The Elite Barbarians were undoubtedly OP, but this wasn't 2016 anymore, so an emergency nerf was considered. Only 1 week after these balance changes went live, the Elite Barbarians would be the victims of an emergency nerf which reverted their first hit attack time back to 0.5 seconds. But the card would remain popular for months, consistently remaining above a 20% usage rate. By June, the second and third most popular Elite Barbarian decks were Golem and Three Musketeers. And you won't believe when I tell you the #1 most popular Elite Barbarian deck as of June 2021 was a Royal Giant Elite Barbarian deck. The iconic combo was being used together once again, just like old times, but this time in a competitive environment. The duo had been through so much, going down different paths just to meet up together once again. Even when these cards seem like they're separating to different paths, they always seem to cross once again. These two have just such a connected history. Also, I really want to highlight this little guy. Heal Spirit and Elite Barbarians got buffed at the same time in March 2021 and have been a powerful synergy ever since. You may have noticed that even though the top 3 Elite Barbarian decks were different archetypes, they still all contained the Heal Spirit. Even today, when you look at all the top Elite Barbarian decks, they all have the Heal Spirit and vice versa. March 2021 truly bred a powerful, inseparable synergy that I don't think anyone would have expected. This card was still the #1 most popular troop in competitive play, consistently remaining around a 20 to 22% use rate. So come June of 2021, the duo would receive one last nerf. This final nerf is the nerf that puts Elite Barbarians in the position that it remains in today. Supercell has always buffed and nerfed multiple stats at a time when it came to the Elite Barbarians in the past, and now in their most strong state perhaps ever, it logically follows that this pattern would continue. However, Supercell would only nerf one stat, a stat that has never been touched in the history of the Elite Barbarians up to this point. They would receive a sight range increase from 5.5 tiles to 6 tiles. The purpose of this was to prevent situations where one Elite Barbarian would run past whatever defense was intended to counter them. A sight range nerf of just half a tile was given to the troop that had the highest usage of any troop in the entire game for 3 months. This seemed like a suspiciously light nerf for such a strong card, but within a week, the usage rate had plummeted to just 9% to a win rate of 49%, which is a balanced state. I think the sight range nerf was a perfect way to nerf the Elite Barbarians, as it was definitely extremely frustrating to see the Elite Barbarian run right past the defensive building. But that's really the end of the Elite Barbarians' history. As of March 2023, it stands at a 7% use rate and a 53% win rate in grand challenges, with only a slightly higher use rate at 11% on ladder. But I gotta say, with the Mega Knight in literally a quarter of all ladder decks nowadays, these mid-ladder menaces are certainly kept in check. Nowadays, you'll see the Elite Barbarians thrive in a multitude of archetypes, including Golem, Hog Rider, and Three Musketeers. 2016 me would have never thought I would say this, but Elite Barbarians are balanced and healthy for the game. Their frustrating aspects have been removed, and they're not being over-leveled and spammed nearly as much as they used to. I do want to say though, ever since they've been in this state, I haven't really been thinking about them as much up until I started working on this video. They were always such a heavily memed card in Clash Royale and had a stereotypical negative connotation that was always fun to joke about. As much as I think the card is better now, it's just boring. I wish they could have worked at a very fast movement speed, but they just couldn't. And maybe they should be boring. It's less toxic for everybody, and after all, they are just a common card. It's just weird to have such a once so hated card be in the position that it's in today. Sometimes I do think about the March to June 2021 era as the Elite Barbarians' last blaze of glory before they finally became a balanced card once and for all. But man, love them or hate them, they left such a legacy on this game and are such a huge part of Clash Royale's history. Elite Barbarians really have always been a special card. One thing I always thought was interesting was the fact that Elite Barbarians were the only card to get a cosmetic change when played in touchdown mode. This may have just been made to show off for the advertisements, but it's interesting how Supercell gave this one card special attention, especially when they didn't have to. And the special attention didn't even stop there, as on November 25th, 2022, Supercell dedicated a special post to the Elite Barbarians because it was their 6-year anniversary, and they hadn't done that for any other card before that. Even Supercell hadn't forgotten the massive impact this card had. And if it wasn't for these guys, we probably wouldn't have everyone's favorite card, Mega Knight, as it's speculated this card was added specifically to provide better counterplay options against the Elite Barbs. As for the future of Elite Barbarians, I doubt they'll be changed anytime soon. You don't want to mess with a delicate card like this. With healthy use and win rates in both ladder and competitive play, and minimal complaints, there's really no reason to change it. I hope you now have a good idea of the Elite Barbarians' impact on Clash Royale. Let me know what you think about the Elite Barbarians in the comments. Also, let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. In my next video, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the new update and sharing some thoughts on whether or not Supercell is being a little too greedy, so make sure to subscribe for that. And as always, thank you for watching and take care.